We have an actual top director, a big executive within gaming, saying the quiet part out loud. There's been a collapse in gaming creativity. And those are the words of Shawn Laden, who used to be the CEO of Sony Interactive Entertainment and is now a strategic advisor over at Tencent. You know who he is. Look at him. You've seen him talk on stage at E3 and stuff. And he makes some really interesting points and presents a very curious crossroad of gaming moving towards a direction where everything becomes better, or us getting stuck in a problem right now that we don't actually know how to fix and it becoming worse. And he's been talking about all of this over at Gamescom Singapore. And I want to look at some of these quotes, some of these interview things, and talk about them, because it's just fascinating to have somebody that is still technically within games address the issue and say all of these things. By the way, I don't think you should take this as good news for Tencent. I don't think he's talking about the plans that Tencent has to improve things. I think he's just talking about the industry in general. But he does point out how a lot of the system is failing right now and what he views as the future, and I have a lot of stuff that I disagree with. So let's get into all of it. Hi, I'm Mug. If you're new here, welcome, and if you're not new here, welcome back. It's nice to see you. Remember to hit the like button. It helps this video reach farther, helps the channel grow, and it's greatly appreciated. Let's talk about the state of the industry and the future of games. Now, Shawn Laden started really strong with something that I've been saying, and I've had a lot of people tell me that I'm delusional, but he says, in the past, we spent a lot more time looking at games and not asking, what's your monetization scheme? Or what's your recurrent revenue plan? Or what's your subscription formula? We asked the simple question, is it fun? Are we having a good time? And if you said yes to those questions, you'd usually get a green light. You didn't worry so much about the end piece, for better or for worse. Of course, back then you didn't make a game for millions of dollars, so your risk tolerance was fairly high. And like I said, I've talked about this a lot. When people were making games back on the PS1 and the PS2, yes, the overall cost was much lower, but the driving force behind making games wasn't as much about it making money or recovering that investment. It was more about, hey, we're discovering what this even is, so if it's fun, hopefully it'll do well. And so he continues, today the entry cost for making a AAA game is triple-digit millions now. And I think naturally risk tolerance drops, and you're looking at sequels, you're looking at copycats, because the finance guys who draw the line say, well, if Fortnite made this much money in this amount of time, my Fortnite knockoff can make this in that amount of time. And that is all 100% true, because that is how currently AAA has to operate. The cost of a lot of these games means that they need to minimize risks as much as possible, and minimizing risks means eliminating creativity. And that is something that I find appalling. Because the more that these things settle, the less creativity exists. Even if somebody came up with a project that was a low investment to try something new, hey, I have a great new idea that could be the future of first-person shooters. Like, no, we're not even gonna invest in that. We need to pump in $300 million into a project. No project under that can exist, so we can't even test out if your idea is fun. We need to go with what's proven. And the way that's been hurting the industry doesn't stop at the design of the games, at games just feeling like the same thing over and over again. It's that they're actively getting worse. Because as the years go by, and a lot of these companies that made their names off of creativity, Ubisoft, Activision, EA, these companies put out great games. That's how they ended up at this position of power. They find themselves in the situation of being a business instead of a game company. And so they need to find ways to keep making more and more money, but they cannot innovate. So they just keep reselling the same ideas year after year. They keep making the same games, but with marginal improvements, and sometimes not even that, sometimes just differences, but also with more ways to make money. They start looking at microtransactions, at season passes. They start looking at ways to increase the audience retention, and that leads to these horrible ideas like Assassin's Creed Infinity of just making eternal single-player games of recycling content through minimal effort, battle passes, and cosmetics to make as much money as possible and keep your players hooked on your game. And all of that is done in ways that does hurt how you design games, because you're not thinking about making them fun, You're thinking about how you can make the most money from them while minimizing any creative risk. And as Laden continues in this article specifically, they cite him talking in 2020 about how the 15-hour AAA game needs to come back, about how games need to be shorter and cost less to make. Basically, I want shorter games with worse graphics, and I mean it. But then he goes on to talk about AA, and this is where I have some discrepancies. This is where I have other stuff to say, because he says the so-called AA titles have largely disappeared. If you can become AAA, you survive, or if you do something interesting in the indie space, you could. But AA is gone. I think that's a threat to the ecosystem, if you will, he explained. Which is really strange to hear, considering that Tencent specifically has a lot of hands in a lot of AA pies. Some of my favorite games this year, things like Stellar Blade, like Black Myth Wukong, like Space Marine 2, and depending on how you want to classify them, stuff like Helldivers, have all been finding a lot of success. And while that's not the case for every AA game, we're seeing a lot more of them find success compared to what they did in the last 10 years. And of course, there's been some flops. There's things like Banisher's Ghosts of New Eden, which from what I hear is a pretty good game, but it just didn't find its audience, it didn't sell well, and Don't Nod, the studio behind it, is suffering from it. That's the team behind Life is Strange and Remember Me, and last year's Jusant, which I recommend if you like climbing. But more importantly, the reason I disagree with this is that I think the traditional view of video games and the tiers at which we place things is kind of wrong now. The term AAA originates from bonds. It originates from the idea that these were surefire bets, that these were games that were going to make a lot of money. And that quickly became really big games with big IP attached to it, with big development studios, large marketing budgets, and therefore you could kind of make sure that they were going to be successful. But that isn't how we understand it today. At some point, AAA just meant, 200 plus employees, big budgets for games, and then we had AA, which was somewhere between 50 to 100 employees and a smaller budget, and we had indie games, which just meant like small pixel graphics stuff. And I think currently the entire industry is very different. I think there's something like a AAA plus when we look at the biggest of the big, when we look at Call of Duties, when we look at Assassin's Creed, when we look at some of the stuff from EA. You're looking at teams that are actually in the 600 plus, in the thousands plus. You're looking at budgets from 150 million all the way up to 400 million, like Concord, which is a quadruple A game. And I think that's very different from other stuff that is considered AAA, but kind of below that. Games that have more manageable budgets, somewhere between the 50 to around 100 million, and with less staff and less budget, have a smaller requirement of making a ton of money from their releases, and I think a lot of different companies fall under here. Stuff like Bamco, stuff like Capcom, a lot of what Sega does, From, and a lot of the publishers that are in AAA+, something like Square or Ubisoft, do come out with games that are in the AAA range, just smaller, still very high cost productions, but are not these massive behemoths that basically have creativity prohibited. And I think some recent releases that have been very successful fall into this category. Stuff like Bloober Team, with Konami technically, and Silent Hill 2, Sparking Zero is definitely not a 300 million cost game, and something like Metaphor Refantatio is a smaller team technically. It's not 400 people. It did have a lot of pre-production time, but it's still, I think today, an Atlas game is considered something AAA, but they're in a very different bracket, and they have all been very successful in their very recent releases. I also think that AA now is a bit bigger. It's somewhere between 40 or 50 employees all the way to 200 with those lower budgets. I think that a company like Pocket Pair is AA, not indie, despite it having only around 40 employees when they started on Palworld, and before that they were indie. But there is a ton of other examples. The team over at ShiftUp that made Stellar Blade was around 110 people. Round 8 Studios over at NeoWiz that made Lies of P was a small team. Game Science was also around the 100-person mark. Saber, which made Space Marine 2, is not that big, and I think that slowly you're seeing a lot of other studios, things like Coffee Stain with Satisfactory, quickly reach that AA mark where they become a different type of studio. And at this point, the most confusing one are indie games, because indie isn't just really small projects made by 2, 3, or 4 people. It's not just Team Cherry anymore. A lot of the time, indie refers to the fact that you don't follow a traditional publisher structure, so you have complete control over what you're doing. So indie can go right now from Hollow Knight all the way to Baldur's Gate 3. Technically speaking, Valve games are indie, and if you asked Valve about their creative approach right now, at least games like Deadlock or Half-Life Alyx would fall under AA. So we're seeing a lot of the space morph, and the most interesting part is that we're seeing that at the same time that some of these AAA giants up on their thrones are falling. Things like Ubisoft, things like Bethesda. And we're seeing a lot of the AA games find success in their place. They're managing with lower budgets, with less people. They're taking advantage of technology and drive and passion to make games that fulfill what some of them would have offered us. The danger there is that those AA outfits aren't attempting creativity. All they're doing right now, in my opinion, is filling a void. They're recovering things from the past and doing things better than the slop that's being fed through the just impossibly uncreative AAA machine. But they're not inventing anything new. And I think that's what they need to do in order to take their spot, to really see everything kind of move around. And then we have crazy success stories like Larian. And I think that's what's going to happen. We're currently moving into a new cycle of video games. We're going to see some of the giants fall. We're going to see others kind of take a more stable place, and we're going to see new competitors start to rise up and expand and grow into bigger and bigger studios that are going to become the new AAA. But they need creativity to get there. You need something like From Software inventing Souls-likes. I mean, they didn't invent them for Souls. They already used that system for a very long time. You know what I mean. Or Larian, which is trying to evolve CRPGs and has done an excellent job of discovering that type of game to a whole new audience. They got there through smaller projects, through crowdfunding, through early access, and now they're using all of that money to expand the studio to work on multiple projects. And it's very easy to see how in 10 years, Larian could be one of the bigger studios, one of the bigger players in the world making video games. It's easy to see how they could maybe even open up a publishing branch. And suddenly, a studio like Larian goes from indie all the way up to AAA, changing how everything looks. But Shawn has more stuff to say, more interesting things, and he talks about how to make games faster and cheaper. He talks about how in 2020 he said that he wanted to see the 15-hour AAA game return, that he thought it was important for gaming for that to exist and to be acceptable. And he says that he's been proven right over the years. And he said that it wasn't some great prediction. He's not a fortune teller. He just spent 25 years looking at graphs. So he goes on to say that games don't get any cheaper and they don't get shorter. They get larger, longer, and more complex, and they become more expensive. The large blockbusters of when people are swinging for the fences are coming in at $150 to $250 million. And that is a huge burden on the game development business model, on the publishers to carry that. And that's led to some of the contraction in the marketplace that we've seen. And he explains, we live in a world where only 32% of gamers actually finish the game. So we're making a lot of game that 68% of the people aren't seeing. And he thinks that the length of a game is not necessarily the deal breaker that it used to be. Because now the average gamer is closer to 30 and they have more money than they do time. And he mentions that when he was over at PlayStation for the PS1, PS2, and PS3, length was one of the top review points, which is completely true. This is where we get those metrics of like how much game do you get per dollar, how many hours per dollar of entertainment you get. I'm sure that for a lot of you, you don't have the time to get into a 100-hour RPG. That's a big commitment. That's something that you need to plan your life around. And if you do have time for games, it's being sucked up by some live service that's designed to suck up your time. And I really do believe that in this environment, games that are shorter of a very high quality, probably something around the 15-20 hour mark, are some of the best experiences that I have, because being able to sit down with a game for a weekend and thoroughly enjoying it and then just leaving it back on the shelf is something that I love. There is a place for very long games and there is a place for shorter games. The problem is that when every game wants to be a 60 to 70 hour massive RPG that you can lose your life into, that ends up affecting the design of those games. Or I like to phrase this a little bit differently. According to my YouTube statistics, this makes sense. I'm not bloody mental. 7% of my audience is from the UK. I'm sorry if that was inappropriate. Also, only like 10% of you are subscribed. Please subscribe, thank you. But according to the age statistics, when we were younger and a game was awesome, even if it was really long and we had that time, what we would do with our favorite games is just replay them. And that's because when a game is really good, you want to keep playing it, and it doesn't matter that there's no more content. If it's just that good, you'll go through the content again. Sure, nowadays there's some other stuff that we could do to add some extra incentive, but we lived in a time where we didn't need carrots on the stick. We just enjoyed the experience so much that we would play it again. And now we don't get to even finish games. And I think that a lot of that comes down to the fact that when you're designing a game to provide at least 20 hours of value to the customer, you forget that maybe crafting a much better 8-hour game and having people replay it 5 times because it's just that good is a better way of designing and making your game. And a lot of that I think comes from design trends as well as people on the financial side that care a lot about, hey, a lot of people aren't going to buy this game if when they read reviews they say it's 8 hours long. But look, Sifu is an incredibly short game and I've replayed it a ton. Why? Because it's a ton of fun and it rewards you getting better at it. I've been chasing high scores on UFO 50 like a maniac, also because I need to complete that. That's a video that's coming up. But because those games are just really fun. Meanwhile, we have people who dropped Assassin's Creed Valhalla because it feels like it's so bloated and just trying to pad out the systems that it has over 100 hours. He also says that we need to stop chasing photorealism, which I do think is on the down right now. I don't think we're chasing photorealism quite as much. We've kind of woken up and understood that there's a pretty healthy point, really, graphically, where we kind of imitate a bit of real life, and then we also just stylize things so that they look good. But he's right, he does make the comparison that we should stop investing so much in photorealistic graphics and focus back on game design, which is, yes, true. But on the graphic side, I just think there's a lot more ways to not spend a ton of money and a ton of like man hours on something, and instead just take advantage of exceptional talent of things regarding art and art design, taking better care of style. Can't wait until we have director of vibes on a game at this point, but that is an infinitely better investment than having, you know, your teams focused on graphics and on assets and on asset approval, just trying to make everything as realistic as possible. And I think that graphics really don't matter. I mean, they do. A lot of people want to look at pretty things, and I do too. I can evaluate that. But if you're putting it on a scale, what's better? A game that is really, really fun to play, but looks pretty bad, or a game that looks amazing and is miserable to play? I know which one I would choose every single time, and I think that's what the market would eventually choose as well. And his final suggestion is that the machines have to do more work, but that doesn't mean AI, which is a smart thing to say. He says that AI cannot create anything new of worth. It puts a lot of stuff together, which makes you think you're seeing forward, but you're not. You're just rehashing backwards. We can depend on the technology of AI at some point to help with certain things, but not for the design or the crux of a game. And which is why he mentioned something like No Man's Sky, where he talks about a game crafted by 10 people, but where there was so much effort put into the pipeline and the tool set of the game that they can let that pipeline do a lot of the heavy lifting of creating an infinite game. I think that's an interesting can of worms as well. What is the value of that infinity? I think it's nice that it's there, but one of the bigger complaints with No Man's Sky was we want a story, we want something to guide us. And in the end, I think Hello Games has achieved something pretty impressive with No Man's Sky at the moment, and Light No Fire is definitely one of my most anticipated games. And while I think that Shawn Laden is right in a lot of things, and I'm very curious to see what he's doing over at Tencent, because if he's not trying to put these things forward, he can speak all he wants that I don't give a shit. He is in a position of power, and I hope that he's implementing some of these ideas in what he's moving and what he's investing in over at Tencent and what he's strategically advising on. But the question is, can we correct things right now? Is the industry moving in a better direction, or are we still falling down the rabbit hole with all of the mistakes that we see laid out here by this man, which honestly are just things I've said across many videos, but it's nice. This is nice to have this validation, I feel. And when it comes to my opinion, my stance is pretty clear. I think we're moving in a fantastic direction. I think that games are looking better than ever because the market is responding, and these ridiculous budgets allow these flops to matter, allow bad games with bad design that don't innovate, that exist to prey on the customer in such a way that they realize that they're no longer a path forward and that too big to fail doesn't exist. And it leaves space for these games that are doing what we miss from good games of the past in the AA space to rise up. It allows indies to grow and find a lot of financial success because those games tend to be so low on how much it costs to make them that they can start building from initial projects that are financially successful into bigger projects that are financially successful until they tackle something like the AA space. And all of that indie stuff really shines by creativity and good game design more than it does any of the traditional metrics of the game is really long and very pretty or it's in an established franchise. And I do think that the current state of the market is leading towards people taking note of these sorts of things and changing them. It is a situation where if creativity isn't injected back again into games, games aren't going to succeed. We're just going to have people playing retro games. We're just going to have people playing the best game that does each of the things that you want. If all we do moving forward is repeat things that have been done with slight variations or combining certain things, a lot of people are just going to go play the greatest ones, the classics, the best ones. This is one of the reasons why we end up doing remakes. And I think that's just proof that if video games are to continue as a business, that if we're going to keep getting more video games like we do right now, new video games all of the time, it can't just be like, oh, it's new and flashy, might as well buy it. They need to start doing things that are new, things that justify their existence today beyond, it's kind of like that thing you like, but we made it now. And I think a lot of indies are aware of that, be that by trying something new or by trying to refine and create the best version of something they love. I think AA is filling a very unique space at the moment, and I think AAA doesn't know what they're doing, and they're either going to wake up or find themselves replaced. In any case, I've been Mug. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you find this informative. I hope you leave this video finding yourself hopeful, but if you don't think that that's where the video game industry is heading, leave some comments down below. Let's have an interesting conversation down there. I want to see what you guys think as well. And if you enjoyed this video, you found it entertaining, then leave a like. That helps a ton. And if you want more from me, from news, reviews, and stuff like this, subscribe. I'm incredibly grateful for you watching, just as I am grateful for my patrons up on the $1 patron wall. It's called that way because there's only one tier. $1. That's all there is, but all of these people support what I do here on YouTube every single day, and I'm very grateful for it. And as always, go out there, enjoy some of the great video games that exist, have some fun, and I'll see you again very soon.